The coffee had gone cold before I even lifted the cup. I was sitting at the kitchen table in my house in Burlington, the one I'd lived in for 31 years, watching the snow come down outside the window the way it always does in February. Slow and indifferent, like it has nowhere else to be. My reading glasses were pushed up on my forehead. My phone was face up on the placemat in front of me, and the message from my son was still on the screen, the way a paper cut stays sharp even after you've looked at it twice. Mom, I need to be upfront with you. Heather feels strongly that this trip should just be us and her family. I hope you understand. It's not personal. I read it 4 times. Then I set the phone down and looked at the snow. It's not personal. I had spent 14 months planning that trip. 14 months of spreadsheets and booking confirmations and screenshots saved to a folder on my laptop called Alaska, Family, Summer. I had booked a 7-night cruise out of Vancouver. The kind with a balcony cabin and excursions, pre-arranged, because I knew my son wouldn't think to book the whale watching in advance and then he'd be disappointed when it sold out. I knew that about him the way you know things about a person you raised. I knew he liked his eggs scrambled, not fried. I knew he got motion sick on winding roads, but never on water. I knew that when he was 11 years old, he saw a humpback whale breach off the coast of Nova Scotia on a family trip, and he talked about it for 3 years afterward. That trip was the reason I booked an Alaska cruise. Because I remembered, I had put down deposits for 3 cabins, one for me, one for my son and his wife, one for their 2 kids, my grandchildren, who were 9 and 12 and had never seen a glacier. I had researched the whale-watching excursion in Juneau. I had pre-booked the dog sledding experience in Skagway. I had ordered matching rain ponchos from a shop in Victoria because I'd read that Alaska summers could surprise you. I had saved for all of it quietly, the way I did most things. A little each month, transferred into a separate account I'd opened at Scotiabank just for this purpose. Because I didn't trust myself not to spend it if it sat too close to my regular savings. My husband, God rest him, used to tease me about that. He said I was the only person he knew who saved money by hiding it from herself. He'd been gone 6 years, and this trip, this cruise, this gathering of the only family I had left, was the thing I'd been building toward, almost without letting myself say it out loud. A trip he would have loved. A trip I wanted to take in his memory, and in spite of his absence, and because life, I had decided, does not pause to let you grieve at your own pace. You find a reason to keep going. I had found this one. The deposits alone had come to just over $4,000. The full balance was sitting ready. I had travel insurance. I had printed the boarding documents and put them in a green folder in my filing cabinet. I had bought my grandson a book about Alaskan wildlife that he'd already read twice. And on a Tuesday evening in February, while the snow came down outside my kitchen window, my son sent me a text message telling me his wife would prefer to keep the trip to her side of the family. Her family. My cabin, my booking, my 14 months. I didn't respond right away. That's not something I'm naturally good at. Sitting with a thing without answering it. I've always been a fixer, a responder, a person who picks up on the second ring, but something made me put the phone down and just sit there in the quiet of my kitchen, with the snow and the cold coffee and the refrigerator hum, and I let myself actually feel what I was feeling instead of rushing past it to be gracious. What I felt was not anger, not right away. What I felt first was something much worse than anger. It was the specific hollow slow embarrassment of realizing you have made yourself smaller than you needed to, for longer than you should have, for someone who did not notice. I thought about the last 18 months. Really thought about it, not the version I'd been telling myself. My daughter-in-law had always been cool with me. I'd told myself it was just her personality, that she was private, that she needed time. I had never shown up uninvited. I had never offered unsolicited advice about the children. I had swallowed opinions that climbed up my throat at Christmas dinners and family gatherings because I loved my son, and I wanted his marriage to work, and I understood, intellectually, that mothers-in-law were a minefield, and I was determined not to be one. What I had not understood, apparently, was that my restraint had been interpreted as irrelevance. That, because I did not demand to be included, I had quietly become someone who could be excluded without much thought. It's not personal. I poured the cold coffee down the sink. I made a fresh cup. I stood at the counter and drank it while it was still hot, which is not something I usually do. I usually let it cool to the exact temperature where it stops burning and starts comforting, and by then it's gone cold again. But that night, I drank it hot because I needed to feel something concrete and immediate, and the coffee was there. Then I went to my laptop and opened the Scotiabank app. I sat for a long time looking at the balance in that account. The Alaska Fund, 14 months of careful, deliberate saving, and I thought about what my son had said. It's not personal, and about what I was going to do next. I did not respond to the text that night. I needed to think clearly, and I have learned at 68 years old that thinking clearly requires sleep and at least one full day between the wound and the response. The next morning, I called my friend Audrey. We have been friends since our children were in the same kindergarten class, which means we have been friends for 40 years, and she is the person I call when something happens that I cannot make sense of. She listened without interrupting, which is her great gift. And when I finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "What are you going to do with the money?" Not what did he mean by that, or how could she say that, or any of the things I'd been turning over in my own head. Just, what are you going to do with the money? I laughed. I hadn't laughed since the text. I said I didn't know yet. She said to call her when I figured it out. I spent the rest of that day doing something I rarely let myself do. I thought about what I actually wanted. Not what was expected of me. Not what would keep the peace. Not what a good mother would do, or what my husband would have advised. What did I, at 68, with a green folder of printed boarding documents in my filing cabinet and 14 months of savings in a bank account, what did I actually want? The answer came to me around 3 in the afternoon. While I was standing in my living room looking at a photograph on the mantel. It's from a camping trip I took with 4 women in the summer of 2019. Me, Audrey, and 3 others, women I had known since our children were small, and we were all too young and too tired and too underpaid to know how lucky we were to have each other. In the photo, we are standing in front of a lake somewhere north of Sudbury, squinting into the sun, looking slightly windburned and extremely happy. I thought, I want to feel like that again. I went back to my laptop. I did 3 things in the following hour. First, I called the cruise line and explained that I would be modifying the booking, removing 2 of the 3 cabins and changing the passenger information on the 3rd. The representative was patient and professional. There were change fees, of course. This is the part nobody tells you, that the fine print always costs something, but they were manageable, and when I gave her my credit card number, I did not feel the number going in the way I usually did. I felt it the way you feel paying for something you actually chose. Second, I transferred the remaining balance from the Alaska fund into my main checking account. I watched the number move. Third, I opened my contacts, scrolled to Audrey's name, and typed, "Are you free the last week of July? I have a cabin on a cruise ship and I'd like some company." Her response came in 40 seconds. I counted. I have never been more free in my life. "Who else are we calling?" We called Patsy, who taught elementary school for 33 years and retired the previous spring, and had been talking about doing something extravagant ever since. We called Rhonda, who had just finished a round of treatment for something we don't name out loud yet, because she says naming it gives it too much real estate in her head, and who said yes before I'd finished the sentence. We called June, not June from the file, a different June, my June, the one who does the crossword in pen and brings homemade butter tarts to every occasion. And June said she would need to check with her cat sitter, but yes, almost certainly yes. 4 women, 1 balcony cabin that suddenly felt less like a symbol of something I'd lost, and more like a room we were all going to cram into together, laughing. I still had not responded to my son's text. He followed up 3 days later. A phone call this time, which I let go to voicemail, and in the voicemail he asked if I'd received his message and said he hoped I wasn't upset, and said again that it wasn't personal, and then, and this is the part that I have replayed many times, not because it surprised me, but because I needed to be sure I had heard it correctly. He asked if the deposits I'd paid were refundable, because he and his wife were still hoping to do the trip, and it would help to have that money applied to their booking. I sat on my couch and played the voicemail twice. Then I called him back. He answered on the first ring, which told me he'd been waiting. "There are things you know about a person you raised." I let him say hello. I let him ask how I was doing. I waited until there was a pause, and then I said, very calmly, because I had had 3 days to get to calm, and I was not going to waste it. The deposits were non-refundable. I used them to modify the booking. "I'm going on the cruise with Audrey and the girls." Silence. Then, "You." "Wait, you're still going?" "Yes, Mom." I rearranged the cabins. The cruise line was very helpful. I leave from Vancouver on July 24th. Another silence. Longer this time. "What about our tickets?" And here is where I said the thing I had not planned to say, but that came out of me, fully formed. The way true things sometimes do when you have spent enough time with them in the quiet. "You said it wasn't personal. So I hope this isn't either." I did not say it with venom. I want to be clear about that, because I'm not a person who functions well on venom. It costs too much and the cleanup takes forever. I said it the way you'd say something that is simply, factually, the case. An exchange of terms. He tried to talk more after that. I let him talk for a few minutes, and I listened. And then I said I needed to go and I'd speak to him soon, and I meant it. He is my son. I love him. This was not the end of anything except one version of something I'd been letting happen. I hung up and sat for a moment in my living room. Then I texted Audrey, called him. "It's done. You're going to need a rain jacket." We left from Vancouver on a clear morning in late July, the 4 of us, with our rolling suitcases and our sensible shoes and a box of butter tarts that June had made and transported, somehow intact, from Mississauga. The ship was enormous. The ocean was very blue. Patsy cried a little when we pulled away from the dock, which she attributed to the wind, and none of us said otherwise. In Juneau, we saw humpback whales, 3 of them, surfacing in a slow, unhurried way that made the entire boat go quiet. I stood at the railing and watched them and thought about my grandson, who had already read the wildlife book twice, and I made a note to tell him exactly what it looked like. The way the water fell off their backs, the sound of their breathing, the way they seemed completely unbothered by the cold. He would want to know. I would tell him. In Skagway, Rhonda went dog sledding even though the guide looked slightly uncertain about it, and she came back glowing in a way I hadn't seen from her in more than a year. Audrey and I drank coffee on the excursion deck and didn't say much, which is one of the things I love most about 40-year friendships. The comfortable architecture of silence. On the last night, we sat on the balcony of our cabin, all 4 of us out there, barely fitting, wrapped in blankets we'd pulled off the beds, and watched the sun go down over the water. In that part of the world in July, the sun takes a very long time to set. It just keeps going, stretching out the light like it's reluctant to let the day end. Patsy said it was the most beautiful thing she'd ever seen. Rhonda said she was coming back next summer. June said nothing, just pulled her blanket tighter and smiled. I thought about what it had cost me to get to this moment. Not just the money, though there was that, but the slower cost of the years before, the long habit of making myself easy to overlook, the careful shrinking, the swallowed words at Christmas, the assumption that loving someone quietly was enough to make them see you clearly. I was done with that now, not with loving. I would always love him, but with the invisible tax of smallness, the particular toll of being grateful for inclusion in spaces I had built. We docked in Vancouver 2 mornings later. The butter tarts were long gone. My feet hurt. I had 17 new photographs on my phone, including one of all 4 of us at the railing in Juneau, squinting into the sun with the ocean behind us. I looked at that photograph for a long time on the flight home. I looked like someone who had made a decision. I looked like someone who had decided at 68 years old that being left behind was only possible if you stayed.